I'm going to have to speed up here. And I'm coming to directly answer Jennifer's question. This world of basically Mad Men, okay, the British equivalent of Mad Men, which means that everybody's badly dressed, and they're drinking beer rather than vodka and martinis, but they're probably smoking twice as much. This world of British Mad Men becomes the target of yet another series of critiques of the mass culture that they're producing. And that happens from a variety of sources. It happens academically, intellectually, by the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School of Marxists. Adorno and Horkheimer published a famous book in 1947, the last chapter of which is called The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, which looks at precisely the way in which the culture industries were used to manipulate the masses into passivity, rather like we saw in the 1920s and 30s, and how personal consumption rendered people docile and content despite their economic circumstances. Our old friend J.B. Priestley publishes The Age of ADMAS in 1955. ADMAS he described as my name for a whole system of increasing productivity, plus inflation, plus a rising standard of material living, plus high-pressure advertising and salesmanship, plus mass communications, plus cultural democracy, and the creation of a mass mind. Okay? Very poorly written. Priestley's losing it a bit at this point, but you get the idea. And the American equivalent, Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders. So again, importantly, this is not simply a British preoccupation. Indeed, many people in Britain, like Priestley, think of advertising and market research as an American disease that has come over to Britain. But the Conservative Party embraced this new world. And one of the key stones of their first administration after 51 was the creation of commercial television. Okay? The BBC, the experts at the BBC, can no longer have a monopoly over broadcasting. They say, we'll invent a second channel, the independent television, ITV, which is set up in 1954. And therein lies a real set of agonized discussion about the role that advertising was going to play on commercial TV, because no one wanted it to be like American TV. Okay? So they set a very strict limit on the numbers of adverts that were allowed to be showed. Remember, commercial TV depended for its revenue from adverts. And so, the obvious thing was to play as many adverts as possible, but they were limited to a certain number of minutes per hour. How many minutes per hour do you think in 1953 they were allowed to show adverts for in an hour's TV? Just think of how much TV you get to watch in an hour on Fox, and then invert it for the number. That will be how long the adverts will be. 40 minutes of adverts. 42 minutes of programming in an hour's TV. Okay, it's 6 minutes of adverts in an hour. Just 6 minutes. But still, that wasn't enough. And so, because the adverts were getting increasingly out of hand, and trying to sell people things like bananas, and soap powders, the real big, there was a massive war between the soap manufacturers in the 1950s, late 1950s. So they introduced the Advertising Standards Agency, which is not a government agency. It's meant to be a form of self-regulation by the advertising agencies to keep adverts legal. This is a quote: legal, decent, honest, and truthful. I mean, that would put, advertising agencies out of business. Legal, decent, honest, and truthful. but it was important to be seen to be doing the work. Politicians also ran to these new experts to lead their campaigns. By 1979, 64% of the Conservative election budget and 40% of the Labour Party's election budget was spent on advertising. And that really began in the late 1950s. So advertising and politics become increasingly interconnected. And then lastly, you'll be glad to hear, we have to cover the alternative way of thinking about politics, which was through the growth of opinion polls. Okay? Opinion polls had not existed in Britain. The US got them through Gallup in the 1930s. In Britain, that didn't really happen until the very end of the 30s and really into the 1940s. And as you remember, mass observation was the one organization that called the result of the 45 election. And there's a close connection between market research organizations and public opinion organizations. So mass observation ended up being turning itself into a market research organization. These use of opinion polls began to increasingly shape not just parties' political campaigns, but their policies. Political parties began to write their manifestos around their polling data. Labour was the first party to commission a private poll in 1956. By 2 decades later, by 1974, they're using tracking polls and daily survey panels to see how their draft manifestos and daily campaigns are heading. And opinion polls saturate the coverage of politics as well. By 1959, just under half of the daily newspapers are publishing weekly polls. By the time of the 1979 election, there are 28 polls published every week. And so too the coverage on television. And the image that you see before you was of Britain's leading political scientist, a guy called David Butler, who became famous as a sort of telly-don because he invented this thing called the swingometer, which was rather like a banana that was anchored, and it was like a dial, basically. And it measured the swing of opinions and of votes from one political party to the other. And it was it wasn't mechanized or anything. He was just like literally move a little dial on a board. But it seemed when I was a kid like so high tech, just unbelievable stuff. Now the point about all of this is a couple of things. First, the old guardians, the old readers of public opinion have been displaced. In the old days, it was journalists and it was politicians who made the claim that they had their nose closest to the ground. They could decide what the electorate wanted and were the conveyors of what public opinion was. Now you had a simply abstracted and quantitative form of public opinion. Public opinion now was not lodged necessarily in people, but in a board of numbers. Okay? And they were numbers that were lodged in aggregate, nationally aggregate numbers. They took very, very little account of local differences and local divergences. And they mapped it, just as the swingometer did, in terms of a competition primarily between two political parties. Okay? So it reduced, in many ways, politics down to into a type of quantitative mapping exercise. In other words, the discussion became about the swings from, the numerical swings and the of opinion polls, not the issues or the old-fashioned debates. And you see this also happening in political science. in the 1950s that political science in Britain moves away from history and theory, which have been the staples of political science, and into psephology and rational choice theory and quantitative behavioral analysis, the stuff that political science departments now do in spades. And it's really grounded in this type of moment, and in Britain is best summarized in the Butler and Stokes book, Political Change in Britain, which is just full of graphs and of tables. So it's the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's an entirely new conception of politics. Think of the old outdoor meetings in the unreformed electoral system in the early 19th century. Think of that public communal thing. Now you're consuming politics on TV as though it was a soap powder, and you are seeing it represented in tables of numbers that basically require you not to leave your seat. Any questions on that before we get to the part that we all look forward to? Bless you. That is a category that is possibly competing for best sneeze of the semester. Any questions? No, I know. It was legend will surround that sneeze. Okay, I'm getting the fact that we need to move on. Okay. So, very obviously I've been telling you that the thing about social democracy was that all the main political parties were into it. Everybody bought into the mixed economy and the welfare state. And that system, the legitimacy of that system came to depend upon its ability to deliver affluence and improve standards of living for the population. That's very, very important, because it's going to be that issue that returns to us when we talk about its disintegration. I've been suggesting that within that new system, politics becomes reorientated away from the fierce ideological debates of the 1920s and 1930s and goes increasingly to a type of managerial emphasis. Who can manage the economy better? Okay? Who has the technical skills to be able to modernize and run the country best? And I'm suggesting that you can see that close connection between the delivery of affluence and the techniques used for that and the way in which they seep into the political process itself, the way in which market research and advertising and opinion polls basically restructure politics itself. Finally, I'm also suggesting to you that in a way, the very success of social democracy, the fact that it improved people's standards of living to an unprecedented degree, unleashed a new consumer culture. It unleashed the ability of people to consume in new types of products, in new types of ways, and drew them into a world of goods that they experience as individuals. That is to say that increasingly they thought about their individual aspirations as consumers, what they wanted, what washing machine, what type of gravy, what type of ice cream, what type of television set. So that the system predicated around thinking of society as a community, as a total system, if you like, also ended up producing the conditions in which people could think of themselves increasingly as individuals apart from that society. And as we see next week, that's going to lead, importantly, to the complete reformation